Hi, this is Becca with Open Space. I'm getting a message that I can't start my video because it's been disabled by the host.
Hi, Becca. You should be good to go now.
Okay, I am. Thanks.
Thank you.
Liftoff of the Delta rocket carrying Blast.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Discovery Festival 2021. My name is Jessica Sosa, and I am with Big Brothers Big Sisters of Central New Mexico. We want to welcome all of our teachers and students for joining us today. We're super excited. We have Bernalillo County Parks, Recreation, and Open Space with us today, and they have a great presentation for you all. So with that, I will go ahead and pass it over to you two.
Hi, my name's Becca, and I'm a UNM student, and I'm an intern at Open Space, and Dustin and I are here together. And we have a video to share with you from with Steve Glass of Ciudad Soil and Water Conservation District. But before we show that, I want to share with you a little bit about Open Space. We are a department of the county, and we're part of Parks and Rec, but we're different from Parks and Rec because rather than using areas for playgrounds or building up spaces for play, we focus on protecting natural and cultural resources through open spaces. And so a lot of our open spaces are used for hiking, they're used for agricultural fields. We have some historic sites such as the Gutierrez Hubble House in the South Valley. And so we focus on protecting things like that rather than putting in a slide, for instance. And so we have some hiking trails. We have some spaces along the Rio Grande and within the Rio Grande Watershed, which our video will be about today. And a lot of our programming that we do has to do with environmental education. And so that's where this video came from. It was some of our environmental education programming. So I'll let Dustin share a little bit more about that. But that's a little background about open space. And let's see. I don't know if you can see it, but I posted the link to our website in the chat. So hopefully that's there in case you want to check out some of our other properties and things on there as well.
All right, thank you, Becca. Appreciate you sharing the link there and sharing some information about open space. Yeah, my name is Dustin Chavez Davis, and I'm the resource specialist with Bernalillo County Open Space and the Parks and Recreation Department. And just to give a little more context, we were founded a little over 20 years ago to protect natural and as well as cultural and historic resources, as Becca mentioned. And we manage and are responsible for stewarding over 1,500 acres of land, and that's spread from the North Valley to the South Valley, all along the Rio Grande corridor here, and from the West Mesa up to the East Mountains and the Sandia foothills. And as Becca mentioned, we manage a lot of trails, we have historic sites, and we have a lot of properties that have important natural resources. So that's forest land, that's grasslands, wetlands, and agricultural land as well that we try to keep in production. And so we all know that water is important to life here. Water is life, and without the river being here, we wouldn't have our city here in Albuquerque, and we wouldn't have all of the great amenities and the cultural institutions that we have here. So I put together a quick little list of different STEAM professionals that we work with in our field. And I want to share that with y'all real quickly. But it runs the full gamut, right? From biologists who study life to ecology, studying our ecosystems and the connection and interactions between plants and animals. So we work with hydrologists, right, who study water and the flow of water. We work with wildlife biologists, and that ranges from mammals to birds to reptiles, fish and insects, right? So entomology. I mentioned botany, right? So studying of plants. There's microbiologists who study the bacteria and other tiny little critters that live in the soil. We work with mycologists who study fungi and mushrooms, which help to make healthy plants grow and to make nutrients available for plants to grow in our fields and in our forests. We work with folks who study forestry, right? So how forested ecosystems work, how fire works on the landscape, and folks who study geology, so looking at rocks and looking at the formation of our landscapes over time. We work with meteorologists and climatologists who study weather and climate. We work with architects who help to design our spaces. We work with planners who help to program those and think about how the human designed world interacts with our natural world. There's lots of engineers that we work with in terms of getting our landscapes designed and working correctly, right? With making sure that the water is flowing where we want it to go, and that our ecosystems are healthy and designed appropriately. So yeah, I mentioned that we keep a lot of land in agricultural production. So we work with lots of farmers. And I think farming is really one of the first forms of science and technology that is so important to our civilization, right? So without that original form of technology, the seed that helps to grow plants that provide food for our community, we wouldn't have our cities and our other forms of technology that came from that, right? So being able to grow food and to provide for our communities with healthy, fresh produce is so important. And it's, I think, a form of science and technology that maybe people don't think of right offhand, right? We saw the intro video that you all shared, which was super exciting, and you have some great partners here in this Discovery Festival, and so we're happy to be a part of that. And so like I mentioned, farmers and naturalists, we use science skills every day, right? And so that's all about experimentation, right? So you come up with a hypothesis and then you test it. So you have to make detailed observations, right? So we're observing what's going on in nature. We're observing, the seed that we put in the ground, is that growing? Does it need more water? Does it need less water? Does it need more sun? Do we need pollinators to get out there and fertilize the seed? And after you make those observations, I think documentation is an important part as well, right? So making sure that you have a record of what what experiments you're doing, what is working, what isn't working, and what can we change for next time and improve, right? And so that's kind of what this technology is all about, is making our lives better, making our lives easier, and providing for the rest of the community, right? So those are some of the things that we do with open space. There's so many different ways to connect, and we love to get students out to visit our open spaces, to get outside and get out on the trails. We know that it's good for our mental health as well as our physical well-being. And so we want to provide access for folks to recreate, safely, to get outdoors and to learn about our natural world. And so that's what we do with open space. We're going to be showing you a video here about the Taharis Creek Watershed Collaborative, and talking a little bit more about watersheds and what is a watershed. So I don't know, if you all have much background on that, but we all live in watersheds, and everywhere you go is part of a watershed, right? So what we try to do is to promote a healthy watershed, okay? And so there's lots of different ways that we can do that. We know that what we do has an impact on our planet, right? And so whatever we develop, whatever we do is going to affect others around us. It's going to affect the wildlife. It's going to affect the plant life. And so we want to make sure that we're encouraging folks to make actions and choices that are going to contribute to a healthier ecosystem. Okay. And so that's kind of what we're talking about here. So Becca, I see maybe we have a few questions already. So maybe we can try and answer those before we start the video.
Yeah, so they are about the open space more generally. So if you're ready for those, I'd love to ask you.
Yeah.
Fantastic. So the first one is, how much open space is in Bernalillo County?
We have, oh, go ahead, Dustin.
No, that's a great question. I think if we're looking at just lands that are managed by Bernalillo County, then we own about 12 different properties, and that's makes up over 1,500 acres. But that's just what the county manages. And so there's lots of other agencies that also are responsible for managing open spaces. So our city of Albuquerque also has lots of open space lands along the Bosque, the Rio Grande River, and the forest areas along the river are all protected, part of our public lands heritage, right? And in addition to city and county open spaces, there's also other federal and state agencies that are responsible for managing land. So we have, the Petroglyph National Monument, which is on our west side. We have the Sandia National Forest, right? And the Cibola National Forest, which is part of the National Forest Service, who manages those lands. So, there's lots of different agencies that have a role in protecting and preserving our open space lands. And I think it's a big part of our culture here and our heritage, and what makes living in New Mexico so special and so awesome is that we have, this mighty river that rolls right through the center of our city. We have the mountains up on the east side. We have the volcanoes on the west side. We have just a really, I think, rich land, public land heritage. And I think, those lands are open to all of us. Our taxes help pay for their management. And, so we have a role as well in helping to steward those lands and to protect them for future generations.
Great, thank you so much. And then the other question we have so far is, do we have any rare or endangered animals here in New Mexico?
We have a lot. I think New Mexico ranks as one of the, maybe the fourth most biodiverse state in the U.S. And so we have a lot of different endangered species, especially because of the way our mountains are, the Sky Islands, where it's mostly flat, low desert around them, or high desert, and then there'll be a isolated mountain range. So species have evolved specific to those mountain ranges. And so we have some in the Sandias. We have the Silvery Minnow is often named. That's in the Rio Grande, and there's some work between the Army Corps and city open space and county open space and state parks to conserve habitat for the minnow, because it prefers very specific I guess habitat types with certain flows in the river, and so. We have the Silvery Minnow. We have the burrowing owl. We have Dustin. Help me name some.
Yeah, so we also have, I think, sage grouse in the kind of northwestern part of the state, which is a type of bird that uses sagebrush as their habitat. And then I think there's a few other birds that are endangered, right? We know that that habitat loss is a major concern here. Our development has pushed a lot of species out of their natural places where they like to live, right? So I mentioned, wetlands as being an important part of our habitat, right? The river, used to flood large areas of the city, right? And it wasn't just confined to the narrow strip of land that it is right now. So, I think habitat is definitely endangered, and there are other species that rely on those areas. So, anything that we can do to help preserve that habitat and to promote, awareness about our different species is really important as well.
Thank you. And another question kind of popped off from that one about the minnow. What river does the Silvery Minnow live in, and how did it get endangered?
It lives in the Rio Grande. And so because of the way we use water, we use it for agriculture. We use it when we have built built up around the river such that it doesn't flood the way it used to. And so a lot of the habitat for the silvery minnow and other fish has been diminished, just because, for instance, we have had like very, very low water in the river since this August and September. And so when we divvy up all the water to farmers and to everyone with water rights, there's not much left for the fish. And so it's that's part of what the drought and the lack of water in the river is part of what causes endangerment to certain fish species.
Yeah, I would just add, I think, Becca mentioned our developments, right? And our divergence from the river as well, right? So we put in, dams that serve important roles, right? So, I mean, they help to prevent catastrophic flooding, right? I mean, the river used to, in the spring, when the snow melts off from the mountains and runs down into the valley, it could be a really dangerous situation, right? And so where we have our communities built, we don't want floods coming through and destroying all of our houses and our farms and whatnot, right? So we put in dams that help to block and stop the flow and control the flow of water, right? And so that's great for us humans, but it's not always ideal for other wildlife species like the minnow, who require little shallow areas for breeding, right? So when the flows of the river change due to what we as humans do, it impacts those other species.
Thank you for explaining that. And then how can I help wildlife at home? The student is asking.
Oh, that's a great question. And there's really a lot that we can do in our own homes and in our backyards. One project that we work with here at the county, we partner with the Valle de Oro National Wildlife Refuge, and they're located in the South Valley. It's 300 acres of former dairy farm that's been changed into a wildlife refuge. And so what that means is that they're actually restoring some of these habitat areas, right? So it's right along the river. They have access to water, and they're able to plant certain areas to really just highlight that habitat for wildlife. And so those, so that is what's happening on the refuge. But they also have a program that's called the Backyard Refuge Program. And that project is all about getting people to make improvements in their own backyards. And so there's tons of plants that are locally adapted, that are native plants, that provide habitat for example, for pollinators, right? So we know that our birds, as well as bees and other insects, moths and butterflies, right? They need pollen from flowering plants in order to feed themselves and to they need that habitat so that they can reproduce and so that they can live and continue to grow and spread out, right? So what we can do is there's small things we can do, like planting wildflowers that are from this area in our backyards. That's going to help provide pollen for the pollinators and habitat for other wildlife. And there's other things we can do as well, like composting our waste, right? And mulching, and all those things contribute to reusing and recycling nutrients. It keeps waste from going to our landfills, and it makes our ecosystem overall more healthy, right? So those are just a few examples. So I would encourage you to look up the Backyard Refuge program, because they have great resources on how to set up a compost system in your backyard, or a plant list with recommendation for different flowering plants that will provide pollen and habitat from early spring all the way through the late fall and into winter. So we're getting into the season where winter is going to be coming right around the corner. So there's not always a lot of resources for birds and for other pollinators. So that's just one thing that we can do is be more conscious of that and try to promote biodiversity in our backyards and in our greater landscape.
And on that note, this video that we have with Steve Glass also has some tips of how urban areas can work to create and protect habitat for other species.
Great, thank you. It looks like those are all the questions we have for now. So if you want to show us the video, that sounds great.
Great, I will share my screen here. Can everyone see this?
Yeah, looks good.
Hi, I'm Steve Glass. I'm with the CUDOD Soil and Water Conservation District, here on behalf of the Rio Grande Stormwater Quality Team to talk to you today about watersheds. What is a watershed? Well, let's start first with the water cycle. As you all remember the water cycle, and it starts in a lake or a river, and the water evaporates up into the sky, into the air, and then it condenses to form clouds. That's the condensation part. Then it falls back to the earth. That's the precipitation part. So we have evaporation, condensation, and precipitation. And you can imagine how that would happen on this model landscape we have here. Down here we have a river. We can pretend this is the Rio Grande River. Up here we have a lake in the mountains, maybe the Sandia Mountains. And those are places where the water would evaporate. They would condense into clouds over the landscape up here. And then when the clouds got heavy enough, the rain or snow would come back down onto the ground. And what happens then? Well, some of it soaks in, and some of it runs across the land back to the lake or the river. So that's the water cycle. You all remember that from before when you learned about that. And that whole process plays out on what we call a watershed. So a watershed is not a house in the back or a shed in the backyard where you keep water. A watershed is named a watershed because the land around a lake or a river sheds the water back to the river or the lake. See? So when it rains, the land will shed some of the water back to the river or to the lake. That's why we call it a watershed. Okay, so watersheds are always named after the river or the lake to which the water flows. All right, so here where we live in Albuquerque, New Mexico, the water flows from the mountains or the escarpment or the volcanoes down into the middle to the Rio Grande River. So this watershed is called the Rio Grande, I should say the E at the end, the Rio Grande Watershed. Actually, the Rio Grande is a river that flows all the way from Colorado all the way to Mexico, even past Mexico into Texas, all the way down to the Gulf of Mexico. So the Rio Grande is a really long river. And we have divided it up into various smaller watersheds. So there's a huge watershed that feeds the entire Rio Grande, but every watershed is made up of littler ones we call sub-watersheds that are parts of the bigger watershed. And the one we live in here in Albuquerque is called the Middle Rio Grande Watershed because we're kind of in the middle. There's an upper Rio Grande watershed that's kind of up in northern New Mexico and southern Colorado. This is lower Rio Grande watershed. It flows, it's pretty much south of Elephant Butte. We're talking about the Middle Rio Grande watershed where we all live. And no matter where you are, no matter where you're standing on land, you're standing in a watershed. Because if you think about it, anytime rain falls anywhere, it's going to flow off and go somewhere. Here in the Middle Rio Grande watershed, it's all headed back down to the Rio Grande, as you can imagine. But anywhere in the world that's not an ocean or a river per se is the watershed, because a watershed by definition is the land, all the land surrounding a body of water like the Rio Grande or this lake that drains into that body of water. See, so the land is shedding the water. That's why we call it a watershed, and we all live in a watershed. Watersheds are really important, because that's how the water cycles from the lake to the atmosphere back to the land, so that all of the living things on the ground can have water to stay alive. Right? So this is our model of kind of a natural watershed. Right up here, we have a mountain with a nice little lake, as we mentioned before. We have some meadows up in the high country. You can see there's wildlife living in the mountains and in the meadows. We have a moose here, and we have an elk, and we have a coyote maybe, right? And then we have some deer in that meadow and a wolf. And here we have a sheep, a mountain goat, I should say. And so we have like alpine parts of our watershed. We have a desert part of our watershed, right? Because that's part of a watershed, can be any kind of environment. So the desert part, here we've got our cacti, we have a scorpion, I want to stay away from that guy. We have a little groundhog there, and we have some snakes, all living in the desert because that's how they're adapted. But it's still part of the watershed. We have a little kind of a lowland meadow here, right? Where we have maybe a buffalo grazing and a raccoon looking for some delicious food to eat. Here's a cougar watching them carefully because she's hungry, right? And over here we have another meadow, a little with fewer trees, but it's a little lower on the watershed, so maybe it's a little warmer, not so many trees. Right, so here we have a very important part of the watershed. This is a wetland or a marsh. We'll talk about that in a while, but you know what a marsh is, and the official name for a marsh or a swamp is a wetland because it's always wet. It's at the bottom of this watershed. So as the water comes down across the watershed, right, it's going to collect in this low spot, and that low spot is going to remain wet all the time. So that's why we call it a wetland. And special plants grow there. They have really dense roots and they grow really thickly. You've probably seen a marsh or a swamp or what we call a wetland. There are just a bunch of plants down there, all special kinds that they have to be a particular kind of plant that can manage to have their roots wet all the time. Up here in the high part of the watershed, that's not true because the trees need to have well-drained soil. They don't like their roots wet all the time. But the wetland plants really like to have their feet wet all the time. So you can see that we've got all of this. You can imagine rain or snow or whatever falling up high in the watershed and following these channels across the watershed through the meadow, right? All the way down to the wetland. It's another channel. In New Mexico, those channels are often dry because we don't get rain all year long. So we call those channels arroyos, as you well know. And arroyos are the streams of a desert ecosystem, right? So these arroyos carry the rain and the snow across the watershed, irrigating the meadows, filling the wetland, and eventually recharging the river. Yeah, that's how a watershed works. And everything that lives in the watershed is all interdependent, right? Like all of the plants that are growing in the arroyos and the grasses that are growing on the meadows, the trees in the meadows and the trees in the mountain, the longer grasses up there, they all feed animals and birds and insects. And those animals, birds, and insects are part of a big system called an ecosystem where everything is dependent on everything else. So in a normal or sort of a natural watershed, we have all of these processes happening in balance with one another. And the rain comes up from the river, it forms the cloud, it rains up here higher in the watershed or lower in the watershed. It irrigates the plants that are growing there. And then what doesn't soak in to irrigate the plants flows down back to the wetland and over to the river. So that's a beautiful description of a natural watershed. And here we have a nice model of a natural watershed. The thing about watersheds are they're so beautiful and they're so wonderful that we human beings like to live in them. I mean, we always live in a watershed, no matter where we are. But when we find a particularly lovely one, we want to move in it. Like this is a lovely watershed, don't you think? This is just beautiful. It's got some deserts, some mountains, some meadows, a wetland, all very pretty and attractive. So we're going to start humanizing this watershed and describe some of the things that happen when humans come in and start modifying the watershed. Okay? Humans moving in doesn't make it not a watershed. It's still a watershed. It's just that when we humans move in, we start modifying the watershed in different ways. Okay? So obviously people are not going to live out on the meadow like the cougar does, or the buffalo does. We need houses to live in. Yes, we got to have houses because we don't have fur and it's hard to stay warm in the wintertime, which you can see it's wintertime right now here in Albuquerque. It's got a little bit cold. So what we're going to do is we're going to take this meadow, we're going to turn it into a little town. Okay, when humans are moving in. Right, so we're going to pull out the trees, right? Pull we'll have to chop down the trees, if you will, going to chase away the wildlife. We really don't want the wildlife around. We want buffaloes and cougars and raccoons and so on in our city. And we're going to completely change the way the water flows across this watershed. Here we have, the channel that goes down to the wetland, but we want our homes to be right here. So we're going to remove this flow channel off of the watershed. And we're going to take out the grass that was there in the meadow and replace it with concrete. Okay, the big difference between grass and concrete. Here you got some concrete. There we have some grass. Let's look at one thing, the difference in how water reacts with grass and concrete. Okay, so here we've got a rain cloud. It's a red rain cloud that looks like a watering can. We're going to rain on this meadow up here. See the rain? Can you see what's happening to the rain? It's soaking in. The grass and the soil under the grass is absorbing the rain. And the rain is getting down to where the grass roots are to nourish the grass so the animals that depend on it can eat it. That happens anytime we have what we call a pervious surface. Pervious means water can penetrate. When we replace grass with concrete to build our houses on, what happens then is the water does not soak in. You know that very well. It just runs off. And so the plants that were once here obviously are gone. But the other thing is that the water that used to soak in now runs off very rapidly. That is a big difference. We call this impervious surface. Impervious, water can't soak in. Impervious, water can soak in. This changes very drastically the way that rain interacts with the surface of the watershed because we modify the surface of the watershed to be impervious. Okay? Then once we have our impervious, our concrete down, we can start building our houses. We have a bunch of lovely houses in our little village. Here we got a bus to take people from one house to another house. Let's see, oh, here's a nice big house for us right by the arroyo there. Here we go. And let's see, here we got a nice sports car. Someone likes to drive. Here we got an off-roader. If you like to do that. What else? Maybe we need a big hotel over here. There we go. And another car. Okay. You can see that things are changing, right? In this little part of the watershed, right? Things are changing. Suddenly we have construction, we have homes, we have pavement, we have sidewalk, we have roofs that prevent water from soaking into. We're creating a lot of impervious surfaces here that are making sure that whatever rain falls on there flows away rapidly, right? So we need to do something to capture all that rain that's coming off of there because it will start eroding the soil around the city unless we redirect it. So what we're going to do is we're going to remove this part of the arroyo and replace it with a channel, a concrete lined channel that leads to a drain that goes underground to another concrete channel that we're going to replace an arroyo with. There we have you've seen these all over Albuquerque, you've seen these concrete lined channels and storm drains that discharge into them. And so now, when the rain comes down on the city, it flows over the concrete, down into that collection channel, and right down there, straight to the river. Okay, it used to flow through arroyos where it could soak in. It no longer does that. Now it flows to a concrete channel where it can't soak in at all. And so all of the water that falls on the whole village goes straight to the river in one place where it used to spread out, right, and go to the wetland. Now it goes straight to the river. So in Albuquerque, there is no treatment of stormwater at all. It goes straight to the river. So that interrupted nature's process of cleaning the stuff that accumulates in the stormwater, in the rainwater. The nature, the wetland, the arroyos that used to be able to soak in, flow slowly, let nature's cleanup processes work on it and clean it up before it got to the river. That doesn't work anymore because now we have these concrete channels, this big impervious area. Okay? Now let's talk about what is in that water that comes off of the city. We put a bunch of cool stuff here, right? We put a car, we put a bus, we put a house. Another thing that we love to do as human beings in cities is we love our puppy dogs. We love, if you look around, there's, like, if you look in the natural watershed, you can see there's a wolf up there, there's a coyote over here. They're very widely spread out. But what we tend to do as human beings is everybody likes to have a dog. So we concentrate the number of dogs in the city way higher than the number of dog-like creatures that live on a natural watershed. And as we all know, when dogs go for a walk, dogs will poop on the sidewalk. And that poop is more concentrated in a city than it's ever been in the natural watershed because there's so many dogs. That poop cannot be absorbed into the soil because they're pooping on concrete. So the worst thing that comes from an urban environment is dog poop. And even bird poop, because our houses attract birds. Maybe some people have bird feeders. Maybe some people leave like a couple of McDonald's French fries laying on the driveway when they get out of the car. All kinds of things that humans do attract birds, and the birds poop too. So we end up with a whole bunch of poop on this hard surface, and when it rains, the poop flows into this channel, down that channel, and straight to the river. So for the Rio Grande, here in the middle Rio Grande by Albuquerque, the worst pollutant in the river is poop. Believe it or not, it sounds disgusting. We have to deal with it because that is our responsibility as watershed residents, is to control that and try to protect the river. Maybe you live way afar from the river, you don't see the river, but as you now know, everything you do eventually gets to the river. Anything you leave on the pavement gets to the river. So we've got the poop problem. We also have cars. Cars tend to leak oil. You can go to any parking lot and look in all the parking spaces. You can see little puddles of oil that have leaked out of cars. That can't be good for the fish in the river. Another thing is that people like lawns and they like trees. They have to fertilize those trees. Sometimes we overdo the fertilization, and that allows the fertilizer to go to the river, and that adds too many nutrients. overnourishes the river, and that allows a bunch of algae to grow. You've probably seen these rivers where you go and there's this slimy green stuff flowing in the water. That's algae. It grows there because there's too many nutrients in the water. And a lot of those nutrients come from the urban environment where fertilizers get away from us, leave our lawns and our gardens, and get to the river. Some people also use weed killer, and they use insect killer. And that stuff that gets in the rainwater, it's going to go straight to the river. And like I said, there's no treatment. There's no way for any of that to be removed in a concrete channel. So all of those things are not good for the river. So, right, we need to be responsible when we live in a city. We need to clean up the poop from our dogs. We need to make sure that we use fertilizers just like it says on the bag. Make sure that we minimize the use of herbicides or plant killing substances or insect killing substances. Minimize those, use them only when you need to, because we don't want to be the guy that harms the river. We want to be responsible citizens of our watershed, right? So that's a lot of stuff that happens in the city. And I want to point out that the people that live in the city, that built the city, they're not on purpose trying to harm the river and the fish in the river. They're just not aware of how connected the city is to the river, right? And now you guys know how connected we are. We've made it really easy for rain to pick up pollutants, go into these channels and straight to the river. The best thing we can do is keep those pollutants off of the surface so that rain doesn't have a chance to carry them to the river. Yeah? So this is one way that human beings modify the watershed. What else do we need when we have a city? Well, we have to be able to get to the city. So here's my bucket of roads. Right? So we're going to build a road. We got to be able to come to and from the city. So here we go, building a road. Of course, as we build a road, we remove things that are in our way. So the cactus goes, the poor little gopher is to run away. Right? We're gonna put more roads because we like going to the mountains where it's beautiful. So what have we done here? We've built a road down through an arroyo. That's going to interfere with the way that the water flows across the watershed. And what does this do also? It creates more impervious surface. Remember what that means? It means the water can't soak in. It concentrates and runs off. So roads are a big place where rain that falls concentrates and runs off, and you can see it on the side of the road. Anywhere you drive, you can see tall plants growing along the side of the road because they're using all the water that's flowing off the road. So the road gives them a lot more water, right? Okay, what's something else? I mean, these guys, they all have jobs. They're going to and from the mountains. They're enjoying their life in the city, but they gotta eat. People in the city have to have food. You know where food comes from? It comes from a farm, right? So over here, we got another meadow that someone who knows how to work with plants and animals is going to create a farm. So what's gonna happen, right? We're gonna chase away the wildlife that was living on the meadow. We're going to interrupt the flow from this arroyo that used to be there. We're going to create a farm, right? Fence it off, keep our animals in. Here we go. Building a farm. This gets interrupted. Here's our farm going in. of course, we gotta have some farm tractors. We gotta have a little farm tractor as well with the farmer on it. You gotta have a big old pickup truck because you gotta haul hay and you gotta haul all kinds of stuff to feed the animals. What kind of animals do we want? Well, maybe we're gonna have sheep. We're gonna have a field where we're growing the food for the animals. And then we're gonna have cows, and we're gonna have sheep, right? We're gonna have, of course, a farm dog, correct? We're gonna have a farm dog. And we're gonna maybe have a duck, a tame duck. Got a couple of piggies. All right. Let's see, where's another little piggy? There we go. There's another little piggy. Got a couple of little piggies. Chicken. We got a chicken. Well, okay. This is great because the farmer is growing food for the people, for his own family, as well as for the people. Yeah. So that's wonderful because the people in the city can then enjoy their lives as they protect the watershed, right? But we've changed the way that water works on the watershed again with the farm, right? We removed an arroyo to create the farm. So that water no longer flows down to the wetland. And we have created a whole different kind of vegetation. It used to be natural grass growing here that allowed the water to soak in. Now part of the farm is like maybe alfalfa to feed the animals. The other part of the farm is where the animals live and walk around and do what? Just like all animals do, they poop on the ground and pee on the ground. And what is happening to all that poop and pee when it rains on the farm? You know where it's going. It's going to the river, right? So maybe the farmer has to put a drain like the city did because he doesn't want his farm to flood. So it's going to build another drain straight to the river, maybe, right? So again, the farmer, not meaning to harm anything, just meaning to live a good life on the watershed and do what he loves to do, has modified the watershed to the point that it poses a pollution problem for the river. Okay? We also, of course, need to be able to get farm produce to the city. So let's build a road from the city to the farm. Okay? Of course, I have that. What's going to happen is we're going to put the road, we got to get across that arroyo to get to the farm. So we interrupted the arroyo. Hopefully we'll put a drain to let the arroyo flow through. Here we're gonna put the farmer's drain in here so it flows to the river. Okay. Again, without meaning to harm the watershed, that human activity actually caused harm to the watershed. It caused harm to the river. It changed the way that the water interacts with the surface of the watershed from what it was before to a new way of interacting. And I will tell you now that as the animals stomp around on that part of the farm where they are, and as the tractor drives back and forth, it mashes down the soil to the point that the soil is almost like concrete. It becomes another impervious surface on the watershed. And the more of those that we put out on the watershed, the less water stays in the soil to nourish the plants. So we end up with more water running off the watershed after humans move on because of all the impervious surfaces we put on there, which interferes again with the way the watershed used to work. Okay? All right, so here we've got water gushing straight from the city down into the river. Here we have water gushing straight from the farm down into the river, carrying poop, carrying drip oil, carrying fertilizers, a lot of fertilizers on the farm, some fertilizers in the city, carrying plant killer because the farmer doesn't want weeds. So all of that stuff is making its way to the Rio Grande. Probably not what we want to have happen. Now that we understand how the watershed works, we can take action to prevent pollution, like we talked about at the city. The farmer can prevent pollution by using fertilizer only like it's supposed to be, or maybe building an absorptive berm at the end between his farm and the river. Those are all things we can do. Another huge thing we can do is reestablish wetlands. Back in the day, here in the middle Rio Grande watershed, before we got here, the river was just half wetland. The river would meander back and forth across the river. The river valley, back and forth across the valley. And every time it would meander one way, it would leave behind a soaked part of the soil that was a wetland. So there were wetlands all along the Rio Grande. But what we have done, because we need to create farms and we need to create communities, is we have stopped the Rio Grande from moving back and forth across the valley and made it go straight. So we've lost 90% of the wetlands that used to exist along the banks of the Rio Grande. And so now all the protection that the wetlands provided for the Rio Grande from the surrounding watershed, from stuff that would flow off the watershed, is gone. And so we can protect our river by reinstalling wetlands wherever we can. How do wetlands protect the river? I talked about earlier how the plants that grow there have really dense roots. They love to have their roots wet all the time. And so when they grow that way, they encourage bacteria, or you might be calling them germs, but bacteria and fungus grow in amongst their roots. And those bacteria will eat all those excess nutrients I talked about, and the poop and the pollutants. They will eat them up, turn them into something that's not toxic, and discharge that to the river. So that's how valuable a wetland is. You can call a wetland Mother Nature's sponge, where it soaks all the stuff that might harm the river up, turns it into something else, maybe lets it go into the atmosphere as carbon dioxide, but it protects the river from this kind of direct connection that we see from the city and from the farm. All right? So wetlands are super important. And beavers, you can see there's a little beaver here that built a dam. That is a great way for wetlands to form. If beavers move in and decide they want to live somewhere down by the river, they build a dam, and the water that's flowing off the watershed will collect behind their little beaver dam and soak into the ground and allow all of this wonderful wetland vegetation to grow that will clean the water before it gets to the river. So wetlands are super important, and we should be advocating for more and more wetlands instead of trying to remove them. And fortunately, a lot of people who are working on the river these days are doing exactly that. We have a lot of agencies that are installing new wetlands along the river to protect it. Our county, Bernalillo County, has actually installed the wetlands at the bottom of one of these discharges over at a place called Sanchez Farm. If you ever get a chance to go see that, they built a lovely one down there that protects the river. So people are starting to recognize how the watershed works, how we impact the river. They're starting to take action. You can take action too. You personally can do things to protect the river. Okay, if you live in a city, most of us do. We live in Albuquerque, or maybe we live in Los Lunas, or maybe we live in Belen, or And we live in cities all over the place, right? And every city has the same issues we talked about earlier. So if you live in a city and you have a dog, please pick up the poop when you take your dog for a walk. Anywhere the dog poops, because remember what we said, lots more dogs live in a city than ever lived in that part of the watershed before humans came. Right? So you got to pick up your poop. You got to use fertilizers just exactly like it says on the fertilizer bag. It seems like not enough, but it's plenty. A little bit goes a long way. If you can avoid using bug killers or plant killers, weed killers, please do. Pull that weed, or live with the bugs, or find another bug that doesn't like the other bug. But if the less of that kind of stuff we can leave on our hardscape, on our impervious surfaces, the more protected the river is. If you live on a farm or you live in a rural area, right, the same kind of things apply. You obviously are not going to be running around picking up the poop from pigs and cows and horses, but you can pick up your dog poop. You can reduce fertilizer use. You can reduce pesticide use. You can do all those things and be responsible to protect the river. We can also advocate for new wetlands. We can recognize the importance of a wetland. Advocate for the creation of new ones. We can drive our cars less. Right? The more you drive your car, the more oil drips out of it. If you happen to have a drippy car, many of us do. If you can afford it, you can fix that oil leak. Whether it's in the city or if it's an oil leak on the farm, you can fix those oil leaks, or at a minimum, you can put a big tray available at any car store full of cat litter underneath your car so that it drips into the cat litter, not onto the driveway. That way it won't flow with the rain. So there's so many things that each of us can do to help protect the middle Rio Grande watershed, or whatever watershed you live in. All watersheds are precious. All watersheds are incredibly important to the health of our environment and the rivers and the lakes that receive water from those watersheds. So I'm just going to turn this over to you guys as watershed stewards, watershed champions. Help us out. Remember how your watershed works. Take responsibility and do everything you can to, one, protect your watershed, and two, tell everybody you know how important the watershed is, how important our individual activities are. Please check out the keeptheriogrande.org website for more information, and have a great day on the watershed.
Okay. We are right at 12:03. I hope that was an interesting video about the Rio Grande Watershed. What did everyone think? Do you have any particular takeaways? Something
We
you
did get
learned?
a couple questions. Yeah, I think everybody loved it. That was really interesting. I know I didn't know anything about watersheds, so that was very educational. Thank you for sharing. Let's see. So the first question is, are we currently in a drought? And if we are, how can we help?
Yeah, excuse me. That is a good question. And yes, we are in a drought. And we're seeing, I think, more and more droughts recently. People have talked about, climate change and our impacts on the climate. Scientists are saying here in the Southwest, we're going to see more drought conditions. And in fact, what they're calling, what we're experiencing now, mega drought and even permanent drought, right? So these are kind of scary, right? But we know that there are things that we can do. You know, we can reduce our own personal consumption, right? So when you're brushing your teeth or washing your hands, you know, making sure that we're using as little water as is necessary, right? And then I think there's other things that we can do as a larger society too, right? Like how we produce our energy, that's a major source of water use. So, going with more renewable sources, I think, is one way that can have an impact there. And then I think, agriculture is a huge user of our water as well. So whatever we can do to make those more efficient, I think, is going to be really good. And so, yes, I mean, there are things that we can do, and it is something that we're going to have to deal with here and all throughout the Southwest, right? So the Rio Grande Watershed, the Colorado River Watershed, we're definitely seeing those impacts now. So, yes.
And if I can add, Steve Glass sort of touched on this, but when we are in a drought, the pollutants that go into the water, whether it's groundwater or water in the river, they become more concentrated. Because if you can imagine, when water evaporates, there's less of it, but whether it's oil or dog poop or any of those pollutants, that doesn't evaporate with the water. And so it becomes more concentrated and can be even more detrimental to the ecosystem then. So cleaning up after our dogs, making sure we're not littering, can all go a long way toward protecting the watershed, especially during drought.
Thank you. And then the other question we had was, if you want a job protecting our watersheds or our open spaces, what kind of a degree would you get in school?
Well, I am currently trying to do that. So I'm in school for planning at UNM, and there's a concentration in natural resources management and environmental planning. Geography is a degree that some people get. There's degrees in environmental science, biology, hydrology. There's lots of different degrees that one can get. We also have public health at UNM. And environmental health is also tied to public health. And so there's lots of different pathways to getting into environmental protection, if that's what you're interested in.
Dustin, did you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I'll just say, I actually, in my undergrad studies, I majored in religious studies. So maybe it wasn't a direct pathway to the current position I'm in right now. But I think there also is, there's an ethical and kind of a moral, reason for being good stewards of the land as well, right? And so I think that's something that I explored in my studies was, our connection to the land and how that plays out through our faith and through spirituality. And then after that, I studied natural resource management for my master's degree. So, there are lots of different pathways. I think, you can do a science, study biology, study wildlife biology, study forestry or botany. So I think there's so many different ways that you can get your foot in the door. And I think just being involved too, as a volunteer or as a regular person, you can take action and you can connect with these different agencies and meet the people who are responsible for taking care of our open spaces and make those connections. And so I think, there's many different pathways that you can take to reach that field.
Fantastic. Well, thank you both so much for sharing so much valuable information with us. We really enjoyed it. I know the students and teachers did too. Did you have any last words of advice or encouragement for our teachers and students?
Well, if I can just add that this video was, again, part of our environmental education programming that we do at Open Space. And this is ongoing. Even during COVID, we did things virtually. And still now we do things year round. And so if you are interested in getting involved, whether it's coming to a program like this, volunteering, we have a lot of different email lists that we send out opportunities to get involved on. So I can drop my email in the chat here. And if anyone's interested in getting involved with conservation or natural resource management through the county open space, you can definitely let me know what you're interested in, send me your name, and I can connect you with some info.
Yeah, thanks, Becca. I just put another link in the chat too, and it has a link to another one of our partner websites, and that's the Talking Talons Youth Leadership, and they do a lot of great environmental education. So there's other videos and other topics that you can explore on that website. And then, yeah, definitely check out burnco.gov/open space. You can learn more about our open space properties. Definitely encourage everyone to get out there and get out on our trails, spend some time outdoors, observing nature. And yeah, it's been a pleasure to to present here and to be a part of this festival. So I really appreciate the invitation and happy to be a part of this. So thank you all.
Yeah, thank you both so much again. And thank you to Bernalillo County. You have been such an incredible supporter of us at Big Brothers Big Sisters and a supporter of Discovery Festival. We absolutely could not do this without our sponsors. So thank you so much. Bernalillo County will have 2 more demonstrations tomorrow and then on Friday. So make sure you tune into those and check out more of what the county is doing right now. And I will close us out by sharing a little slideshow thanking all of our sponsors. And thank you so much to you two again.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.